The candle in the tower window had been burning for 4 hours when the Duke of Caervon arrived at the base of the wall. He stood in the shadow of the old stone keep, one hand pressed flat against its surface, head tilted back, looking up. His horse was tethered in the dark copse of trees behind him. No groom had accompanied him tonight. No valet, no footman, no carriage bearing the Caervon crest to announce his passage through the Dorset lanes. He had come alone, at speed, through back roads he had no business knowing, with nothing but a single fragment of conversation pressing behind his sternum, like something that refused to stay quiet. She has not confirmed her attendance. Crown Princess Sophia had said it at Lord Fenwick's gathering earlier that evening, so her brow furrowed with a particular kind of concern that Adrian had learned to read over years of court. It is unlike her. Lady Alara is always so thoughtful about correspondence. I do hope nothing is wrong. The flame above him trembled in the October wind, small and determined, utterly alone in the high dark. Something was wrong. He had known it before he left the gathering. Known it in the same bone-deep certainty with which he knew other things. That the storm the night before Waterloo would be the last one some men would ever see. That his brother's laugh had been too bright that final morning at Caervon. Too bright and too brief, already leaving even as he spoke. That the woman at the far end of Lord Hargreaves' dinner table, seated below the salt as someone's attendant rather than someone's guest, was more than anyone in that room was willing to recognize. He pressed his other palm to the stone. Cold. Rough with decades of lichen and the work of rain. The ivy was thicker near the base, thinner near the top, where the wind had stripped it to dry tendrils. There were handholds, if a man was willing to look for them. Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Caervon, the most feared vote in the House of Lords, the man who had earned his military rank through action rather than inheritance, looked up at that solitary flame and made a decision that his valet would later describe as the single most undignified act in the 3-century history of the Caervon dukedom. He began to climb. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, or drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. But to understand why a man who had stood before kings without blinking now pressed his cheek to cold stone with mud on his boots and his coat already abandoned on a garden hedge, we must go back. 3 days back, to the morning the letter arrived at Crane Manor, with the royal seal pressed in gold wax, and to the woman who had read it in a patch of October sunlight, with her tea gone cold, and her heart doing something careful and terrified and full of hope. Ilara Voss had long since perfected the art of occupying space without disturbing it. She had been at Crane Manor for 3 years, since her father's death had closed the doors of Vossmore House for the last time. And in those 3 years, she had learned the particular discipline required of the unnoticed woman. She rose before the household. She breakfasted on whatever the kitchen could spare without causing inconvenience. She catalogued her uncle's library, which no one else had touched in a decade, because it gave her occupation, and because books were the only company in that house that treated her without condescension. She mended. She copied correspondence. She answered the door when the footmen were occupied, and she helped with arrangements when Lady Constance's headaches made everything too overwhelming to manage without assistance. She did not complain. Complaining was a luxury that required someone willing to hear it. She was 24 years old, the daughter of an earl who had loved her deeply and managed his estate poorly, and the world had decided she was nobody. Not ugly enough to be pitied, not pretty enough to be pursued, not wealthy enough to be courted, not quite poor enough to be dismissed entirely. She existed in the uncomfortable middle space where society placed women who had once been something and were no longer. Politely acknowledged, genuinely forgotten, perpetually behind the curve of whatever conversation mattered most. Her Uncle Aldrich was not an unkind man, in the way that a closed window is not unkind. He simply wasn't open to anything. He ate his meals, managed his modest investments, and allowed his wife to manage everything else, including the question of what to do with his late sister's daughter. Aldrich Crane had not looked directly at Alara in 6 months. This was a fact. She had stopped noticing the way one stops noticing a persistent draft. It was simply part of the atmosphere of the house, the quality of the air one breathed here. Lady Constance, however, looked at her constantly. It was not a comfortable kind of looking. It was the looking of a woman calculating value, finding it insufficient, and resenting the calculation being forced upon her in the first place. Every glance landed with the same verdict. Here is something that costs me and earns me nothing. "You have ink on your chin again," Lady Constance would observe, in company, without lowering her voice. "You have worn that dress to 3 consecutive dinners," she would note, in the tone of someone documenting a moral failing. "Why do you always look as though you're thinking something?" she had asked once, with genuine puzzlement. "It makes people uncomfortable." Alara's cousin Cecilia had inherited her mother's talent for such observations, but delivered them with a prettier face, and therefore less obvious intent. Cecilia was 21, golden-haired, enthusiastically fashionable, and devoted to the project of her own magnificence, with the single-mindedness of someone who considered beauty a full-time occupation. She was not cruel, precisely. She simply did not consider Alara enough to be intentionally cruel to her. One must care about a person to wound them on purpose. Cecilia's damage was entirely accidental, delivered with the guileless certainty of someone who had never been required to doubt her own centrality. What saved Alara from genuine despair, or what had saved her until recently, was the work. 3 times a week, she crossed the city to the royal palace and tutored Prince Arthur and Princess Charlotte in reading, history, and the rudiments of music. She had obtained the position through a friend of her late father's, a woman who had known Alara as a girl and recognized in the quiet, bookish daughter of a failed earl something worth placing carefully. It was not glamorous work, and it was not particularly well-compensated work, but Arthur was 9 years old and dreadful at spelling and entirely wonderful about it, attacking every incorrectly written word with the cheerful determination of someone who assumed the letters would eventually cooperate. And Charlotte was 7 and had recently decided that all of history ought to be narrated exclusively through the lens of its horses, and Alara found, to her consistent surprise, and the 2 mornings a week spent in an actual palace with 2 children who were simply and entirely themselves, was the closest thing to genuine happiness she had managed in 3 years. Crown Princess Sophia noticed things. It was among her most distinguished qualities, and her husband, the Crown Prince, had long since learned to trust her noticing above the reports of his advisors. She had noticed that the children came home from their lessons calmer, more settled, quicker to laugh. She had noticed that Arthur's handwriting had improved dramatically, and that Charlotte had begun, unprompted, to draw horses with historically accurate tack, which Sophia considered a significant intellectual achievement for a child of 7. She had also noticed the young woman who sat quietly at the back of the royal music recital 6 months prior, the one who had stepped forward without fuss when little Charlotte panicked in the middle of her piece and forgot every word she had rehearsed, who had simply begun to sing alongside her, to cover the silence in a voice so clear and true and entirely unself-conscious that it stopped conversation in a room full of people who were notoriously difficult to stop, and who had then sat back down as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Crown Princess Sophia had written the invitation to the Royal Winter Ball herself, not through her secretary, not through the formal channels of the palace invitation office. Herself, in her own handwriting, on the good paper with the gold seal that meant the invitation was personal, deliberate, and not a matter of protocol, but of genuine desire. Lady Alara Voss is requested by Her Royal Highness to attend the Royal Winter Ball as Her Highness's personal guest. Alara had read it 4 times before she believed it. She was in the library when it arrived, cross-legged on the floor between 2 stacks of volumes she was recataloguing, her hair coming unpinned at the back, her good morning dress exchanged for an older one she kept for heavy work, and the footman who had delivered the letter had looked at her with an expression of profound uncertainty, as if questioning whether he had found the correct person. She read it a 4th time. She traced the gold seal with one ink-stained finger. Then she pressed the letter to her chest, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to feel the thing she almost never permitted. The tentative, terrifying bloom of something like happiness. She owned one evening gown. She had purchased it 2 seasons ago for a wedding she had ultimately been unable to attend because Lady Constance had developed a headache of exceptional severity on the morning in question. The gown was ice blue silk, slightly outmoded in its cut, but beautiful in the way that good fabric is always beautiful regardless of fashion. She had been keeping it for an occasion that never seemed to arrive. Here, at last, was the occasion. She should have known better than to look happy at breakfast. Lady Constance noticed happiness the way a hawk notices movement in long grass, with immediate, focused, entirely predatory attention. "What is that?" Lady Constance said, her eyes fixed on the letter Alara had unwisely brought to the table, still warm from repeated reading. An invitation. From whom? There was no concealing the answer. The royal seal was visible, even folded. Alara placed the letter on the table and watched Lady Constance read it. She watched the sequence of expressions cross her aunt's face. Confusion, then comprehension, then a particular species of fury that Lady Constance was too practiced to allow onto the surface. So it went underground instead, and became something far more dangerous. Calculation. Lady Constance set the letter down. She picked up her cup of tea and drank from it with the careful deliberateness of someone taking time to choose which response, among many possible responses, would serve her purposes best. "The Royal Winter Ball," she said at last. "Yes. You. Yes." Cecilia, who had been eating her toast with the serene self-absorption of someone who assumed all news was fundamentally about herself, looked up and registered the letter. Her expression moved quickly through several stages before settling into something Alara recognized, the particular, aggrieved sulk of a beautiful woman whose superiority has just been challenged from an unexpected direction. "Why would the Crown Princess invite you?" Cecilia asked, with genuine puzzlement rather than malice, which somehow made it worse. "I tutor her children." "Yes, but..." Cecilia waved her hand vaguely, gesturing at all of Alara in a single dismissive motion. I mean, Cecilia, said Lady Constance, very quietly. Cecilia was quiet. The preparation for the Royal Winter Ball had consumed the Crane household for 3 weeks prior to this morning. Cecilia's gown had been ordered from the finest modiste in the city, altered twice, and would be altered once more before the evening. Her hair had been arranged and rearranged, and arranged a third time, in the manner of an ongoing negotiation. Lady Constance had procured new gloves of a particular shade of cream that had required correspondence with 4 separate merchants across 2 counties. The household had been remade, top to bottom, in service of one evening, Cecilia's evening, the evening that was meant to place her before the greatest concentration of eligible titled men in the kingdom and allow nature to take its admiring course. And now, here was Alara, in her ink-stained work dress, with her old blue silk hanging uselessly upstairs, and holding a letter with a royal seal that outranked every carefully cultivated plan Lady Constance had ever laid. The hours between that breakfast and the following evening had a particular quality of tension that Alara had learned to recognize in this household. It was the tension of a decision being made in private that would be executed without consultation, without warning, and without any mechanism for appeal. Lady Constance was pleasant at dinner that evening, pleasanter than usual, in fact, which was always the tell. She complimented Alara's arrangement of the centerpiece flowers. She asked with apparent warmth about the royal children's progress. She said not a single word about the ball. Alara should have been warned by the warmth. They came for her at 10 o'clock that night, or when the rest of the household was occupied with the final fittings and the packed trunks and the last-minute anxieties of women preparing for a royal event. 2 footmen stood in the doorway of Alara's room with the expressions of men who had been given orders they did not like and were going to follow them anyway, because that was what one did when one's livelihood depended on it. Lady Constance asks that you see to the library, said the elder of the 2, a boy called James, who had once, months ago, briefly smiled at Alara in passing. He was not smiling tonight. There's a discrepancy in the inventory she needs addressed. At 10 o'clock at night, Alara said. Yes, miss. She looked at them both. She looked at all the things she might reasonably say, the arguments she could make, and the appeals to her uncle, who was somewhere downstairs, pretending with practiced expertise not to know what was happening in his own home. She looked at the fear behind James's deliberately neutral eyes, the fear of a young man in a precarious position, being asked to do something that distressed him by a woman who controlled his references, his wages, and his ability to eat. Alara rose from her chair. They walked her not to the library, but to the east wing, through the oldest part of Crane Manor, the portion that predated every modern improvement and retained all of its original stone chill and the particular smell of centuries compressed into walls, damp and wood smoke and time. Up 2 flights of stairs that wound in tight spirals, to a door at the top that Alara had always assumed led to a disused music room, the kind of room old houses acquired and forgot. Lady Constance stood on the other side of it. She stood with her hands folded and her expression composed with perfect, practiced smoothness, and she looked at Alara the way one might look at a minor administrative complication about to be resolved. "You'll be comfortable enough?" Lady Constance said. "There is a chair, and I believe several books on the shelf. The lock is stiff from disuse, but it holds perfectly well." Alara looked at her. She took in everything. the certainty in her aunt's posture, the finality in her tone, the key already in her hand, the footmen positioned behind her with their miserable, resolute faces. She thought about every response available to her, from fury down to pleading, and she recognized, with the clarity of a woman who had learned to see clearly in the absence of hope, that none of them would accomplish anything except make this moment last longer. "The ball is tomorrow," Elara said, "and you are, unfortunately, unwell." Lady Constance's voice did not waver. "A fever, I think. Very sudden. Very regrettable. I will send word to the palace in the morning with our sincere apologies. The Crown Princess invited me personally. Crown Princesses extend a great many personal invitations. She will hardly mourn one absent tutor among hundreds of guests." Lady Constance tilted her head slightly, an almost maternal gesture that did not reach her eyes. "You are a tutor, Elara. Whatever else you may imagine yourself to be, whatever your late father may have told you, you are a woman without income, without connections, and without prospects, living in my home at my expense. The sooner you accept that clearly, the easier all of this becomes. For everyone." The footman stood immovable. Her uncle's study downstairs remained quiet. Elara walked past Lady Constance into the room. It was exactly as described. A chair, a small writing table, a narrow window set 3 feet deep into the stone, a shelf of books no one had opened in 2 decades. A candle had been lit and placed on the table. The room smelled of cold and old paper and the ghost of music that had once been played here and was played no longer. The door closed behind her, the lock engaged with a sound like something final. She heard footsteps descending the stone stairs, growing quieter, then gone. Elara stood in the center of the small room and looked at the candle flame. For a long time, and she simply breathed. She was 24 years old. She had endured dismissal and condescension, and the particular slow erosion of being treated as though she were less than she knew herself to be. She had buried her father without time to grieve him properly. She had watched the home of her childhood close its doors. She had accepted conditions she had not chosen and made a life of useful, quiet invisibility in a household that required her labor and withheld her dignity. She had done all of these without complaint, because complaint required a willing listener, and she had learned long ago to conduct her battles entirely within herself. But tonight, alone in the stone tower with her ice-blue gown still hanging downstairs, and the royal winter ball beginning tomorrow without her, while she allowed herself to acknowledge the things she had been carefully not feeling since breakfast. It was not grief for the ball itself, not for the dancing or the spectacle or the chance to stand in a room where someone who mattered, someone who had seen her and deliberately chosen her, had said, "Come, I want you here." What sat in her chest tonight had less to do with candelabra and orchestra music than with the simple, devastating impossibility of being wanted. Crown Princess Sophia had wanted her there, not as an attendant, not as a useful afterthought, not as a companion to be displayed or hidden as circumstances required, as a guest, as herself, as a person worth specifically inviting. Elara pressed her fingers flat against the cold stone windowsill. The chill moved up through her palms and into her wrists, and she let it, because she was a woman who had learned to let small discomforts anchor her when the larger ones threatened to become too much to hold. She looked out through the narrow window at the October night. The estate's grounds stretched below her in darkness, the bare trees standing in their rows, The path to the gate winding out toward the road and the city and the palace where, tomorrow evening, the lights would blaze and the orchestra would play, and the crown princess would look toward the door one time too many and eventually stop looking. Alara turned from the window. She picked up one of the old books from the shelf, a treatise on navigation by the stars, which wasn't what she would have chosen under different circumstances. And she sat down in the chair, and she opened it, and she read. Because this was what she did. This was what she had always done. She endured things. She found the next task that needed doing, and she did it. She kept going, because going had always been the only real option available. She simply did not expect anyone to notice she was gone. Adrian Blackwell had not, in the general way of things, wished to attend Lord Fenwick's gathering. This was not unusual. For 2 years, Adrian had not wished to attend most things, and he had attended them regardless, because duty was the scaffolding that kept the structure of his life upright when everything interior had long since been stripped to bare walls. He was 32 years old, and the world had decided, with considerable consensus, that he was the sort of man other men stepped aside for and women found frightening, which he had been told was a form of respect and had always experienced as a form of isolation. His secretary kept his calendar with military precision. His steward managed his estates with an efficiency that left him very little that actually required his presence. His solicitors oversaw his financial interests and sent quarterly reports he read with attention and found, at the end, that he had understood everything and felt nothing. Parliament required him 4 months of the year. The rest of the time, the world required the Duke of Carvon in the form of his name on documents, his face at gatherings, his voice at dinners, his careful and unimpeachable conduct across all social occasions. He gave all of this. He gave it reliably, competently, and with the quality of contained emptiness that his contemporaries had learned to read as dignity, and which Adrian knew, in the very small hours of very long nights, was something closer to the absence of everything that made a life worth inhabiting. He had not always been this way. There had been before Philip, before everything Philip took with him when he went, a version of Adrian Blackwell who argued too passionately and laughed too readily and threw himself into things with a recklessness that made his father despair and made his brother Philip laugh until he had to sit down. Philip, who was 3 years younger and half a head shorter and had their mother's brown eyes and their father's infuriating talent for finding joy in things that other people walked past. Philip, he who had died 26 months ago at the Cairvan Country estate, thrown from a horse on a clear autumn morning, in the absence of the older brother who had sent him there alone because there was a parliamentary session that could not be missed. Adrian had been a different man after. He had not, he was reasonably certain of this, become cruel. He had continued to do his duty, to treat the people around him with correct and formal courtesy, to appear where he was required and perform what was required of him with unimpeachable adequacy. But something had closed. Something had drawn back from the world in the way that a tide withdraws, leaving behind a wide and navigable shore and the absence of everything that had once made the shore worth visiting. He had been engaged once. Lady Isolde Hargreave, 3 years ago before. She had been appropriate in every measurable way, and she had been honest enough, eventually, to tell him that she was in love with another man, and would he mind very much if the engagement were set aside. He had not minded. He had felt, if he was truthful with himself, largely relieved, and the relief told him something about the engagement that he had been carefully not acknowledging for months. Since then, the world had offered him other women, through mothers and matchmakers and well-meaning friends. And he had attended the introductions and made the conversation, and found, at the end of each carefully arranged evening, that he had been entirely, effortlessly unmoved. Until Lord Hargreaves' dinner party 5 weeks ago, when a woman seated at the far end of the table in a dress that was at least 3 seasons behind current fashion had quietly, precisely, and without any apparent awareness that she was doing something unusual, corrected a confident man's factual error about the Battle of Carvan Pass. She had cited the Chronicle. She had given the correct date and the commanding general's full name, and then she had returned her attention to her plate with the composure of someone who considered the matter settled because it was. She had not apologized. She had not softened the correction with feminine self-deprecation. She had simply been right in public without asking anyone's permission to be right. The room had gone quite still. Adrian had watched from across the table with the arrested attention of someone who has been unexpectedly shown something true. She was not beautiful in the manner the word was usually applied. Her profile was serious, her dress was plain, and she held herself with a contained quality that made her seem smaller than she was until you looked more carefully and realized the containment was not smallness, but precision. The discipline of a person who moved deliberately because they had decided exactly where they were going and saw no reason to take the long way. He had tried to find her after dinner. Lord Hargreave had waved the question aside. "Oh, just Crane's niece. Nobody, really. Used to be old Vossmore's daughter, before the trouble with the estate." Used to be. So as if circumstance had diminished her into something less than she had been, as if she were defined primarily by what she had lost, rather than by what she clearly, inarguably, still was. Adrian had thought about her for a week. He had thought about the way she had said the correct date without raising her voice, the way she had not apologized for knowing it, the way she had caught his eye briefly across the table, just for a moment before she looked away, with an expression that was not coy or hopeful, but simply present, awake, seeing him as clearly as she seemed to see everything else. He had not sought her out after that week. He had told himself a number of things about why this was the sensible course of action, including the truth that the social distance between a duke and a penniless young woman in someone else's household was not a distance easily crossed without causing damage to the party with less to lose. He told himself he was being responsible, which was a comfortable story. He told himself he was protecting her, which was the most comfortable story of all, and therefore the one he most suspected was wrong. And then Crown Princess Sophia had said, at Lord Fenwick's gathering, looking away into the middle distance with a slight frown. She has not confirmed her attendance. Lady Alara is always so thoughtful about these things. I wrote to her personally. I do hope nothing has happened. Something had happened. Adrian had known it before the words were finished. He had made his excuses to Lord Fenwick, some who looked startled. The Duke of Caervan did not leave gatherings early. The Duke of Caervan did not leave gatherings at all before the socially appropriate hour, and he had walked past his waiting carriage in the drive and gone directly to the news where his horse was stabled. He rode through the back lanes of Dorset in the October dark without any conscious plan. He rode with the single, pressing knowledge that a woman who was always thoughtful about correspondence had not confirmed an invitation that the Crown Princess had written herself, in her own hand, on the good paper with the gold seal, and that the household in which this woman lived without protection or recourse was run by a woman who had recognized in that breakfast that Alara's moment of being chosen was an inconvenience to be managed. Or he left his horse in the trees behind the east wall of the Crane estate and went the rest of the way on foot. He followed the old stone wall to the corner where the medieval keep rose against the October sky, darker than the dark around it. In the tower window, 4 stories above him, a candle burned. One small flame, steady and solitary in the high dark, not flickering now but burning with the particular patience of something that had decided it wasn't going to go out. Adrian stood at the base of the wall and looked up at it. He thought briefly about what he was about to do, and what it would mean, and all the things he was supposed to be, that a man climbing a castle wall in the dark, alone, without invitation, was decidedly not. He thought about Philip, who would have found this the funniest thing in his considerable catalogue of things the Duke of Caervan had done wrong. He thought about the dinner table 5 weeks ago, and a woman who had been right without apology, and the way it had felt like being shown a door he had forgotten existed. He found the first handhold in the ivy. He found the second in the stone itself, where a century of weather had worn a niche just wide enough for a man's fingers if he was willing to commit to it. He began to climb. The stone was colder than he had anticipated, and the ivy thinner, and the wind at the second-floor level had an opinion about what he was doing that it expressed with considerable force directly into his face. Adrian climbed anyway. He had, in his military years, scaled worse, but he had crossed rivers in February and navigated ravines in the dark, and once, during a particularly ill-conceived operation near the Belgian border, spent 3 hours suspended from a cliff face by a rope that his commanding officer had later described as optimistically thin. None of those occasions had felt quite like this. Those had been duty. Clear, direct, sanctioned duty, with orders behind them and men depending on the outcome. This was something else entirely. He had no orders. No one knew he was here. No one had sent him, and no one would come after him. And when he reached that window, if he reached it, if the ancient ivy held, and the stone didn't give, and his arms, which were reminding him pointedly that he had not scaled anything in 2 years, and did not decide this was the moment to reconsider, there was no guarantee of anything at all. She might be asleep. She might scream. She might look at him with the same composed, clear-eyed directness she had used on the man who had the wrong date at Hargreaves' dinner, and tell him, without apology, that he had made a significant miscalculation. He reached the 3rd floor. The window there was dark and shuttered. He rested for a moment, cheek pressed against the cold stone, breath coming harder than he would have liked, and looked up at the single light still burning above him. Still burning. He kept climbing. The window, when he finally reached it, was narrow. Narrow enough that he understood at once why it had been chosen. The room beyond it was a cage designed to look like inconvenience rather than confinement, which was, he thought, and very much in keeping with everything he had gathered about Lady Constance Crane. She was a woman who preferred her cruelties to look like circumstance. He hooked one arm over the stone ledge and steadied himself, and then he knocked. 3 times, quiet, so as not to carry down through the house below. The silence on the other side lasted long enough that he began to construct contingencies. He could wait. He could attempt to speak through the glass. He could— The candle moved. Its light shifted from the table to the window, approaching slowly, and then the shutter moved inward, and Ilara Voss stood 2 feet away from him, holding the candle in one hand and a very heavy navigation treatise in the other, raised in the manner of someone who had decided that if there was going to be a confrontation with whatever was outside this window at this hour, she intended to have the first advantage. She looked at him. He looked at her. The candle flame between them was very small and very bright. "Your Grace," she said after a moment. Her voice was entirely steady. She lowered the book. "Miss Voss," Adrian said. She looked at his hands gripping the stone ledge, at the ivy crushed under his fingers, at the 4-story drop behind him, and the absence of any apparatus that might explain his presence at her window. She looked at his face, which was, he was aware, not presenting its most dignified aspect, being approximately level with the sill and framed by the dark of an October night. "You climbed the wall," she said. "Yes." "The east wall?" "Of 4 stories. It is the wall with the most ivy." Ilara considered this. She set the navigation treatise down on the sill. She looked at him again, with that particular quality of attention he had noticed across the Hargreave dinner table. The attention of someone who was genuinely looking, gathering information, reaching a conclusion based on evidence rather than expectation. "Are you going to fall?" she asked. "I would prefer not to." She stepped back from the window. "Then come in before you do." The window was not designed to admit a man of his dimensions, and the process of getting through it required a sequence of undignified adjustments that he suspected she was watching with more composure than the situation warranted. He got one knee onto the sill, then an elbow, for then there was a moment of deeply ungraceful negotiation with the window frame, and then he was inside, standing on the stone floor of the tower room with ivy debris on his coat and a cut on his right palm from a piece of sharp stone he had not noticed until now. Ilara looked at his hand. She crossed the small room to the writing table, opened the single drawer, and removed a folded cloth handkerchief with the calm efficiency of someone who had decided the situation called for practical response rather than continued astonishment. "Give me your hand," she said. He did. She pressed the cloth against the cut without hesitation, her fingers firm and cool, and he looked at the top of her bent head and the loose, dark hair coming away from its pins and the ink stain she always seemed to carry on her index finger, and felt something in his chest shift with the slow tectonic weight of something that has been building for weeks and has finally found the moment it was waiting for. "You should not be here," she said, still looking at the cut. "No." "This is—" She paused, pressing the cloth more firmly. "This is not a thing that dukes do." "I begin to think," Adrian said, "that I have been considerably too concerned with what dukes do." She looked up at him then. The candlelight was unkind to no one in particular, and very kind to her, warm on the angles of her face, catching in her eyes, which were dark and clear and doing something complicated that he could not quite read. He had found, in 5 weeks of intermittent thinking about Ilara Voss, that he could not predict her responses the way he could predict almost everyone else's, and she did not follow the usual architecture. She did not perform surprise or distress or gratitude in any of the registers that were fashionable among women of her acquaintance. She simply responded as she was doing now, from some interior conviction that had nothing to do with what was expected of her. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Crown Princess Sophia mentioned this evening that you had not confirmed your attendance." "I see." She was concerned. I was. He stopped. He considered the word concerned, which was accurate and also insufficient. I was already on my horse before I had decided to be. Elara was quiet for a moment. She let go of his hand. The cut had mostly stopped, and she folded the cloth over itself and set it aside with the same precise economy with which she seemed to do everything. "Lady Constance told me she would send word to the palace," Elara said. "A sudden fever. Very regrettable. Yes, I imagine she will. She is very good at constructing the appearance of unfortunate circumstance." Elara walked to the window and looked out at the dark estate below. Her voice was perfectly level, which Adrian had begun to understand was not the absence of feeling, but its very controlled surface. The contained quality he had noticed at Hargreaves, the discipline of a woman who had learned not to spend her emotion in front of people who would use it against her. She has had a great deal of practice. Adrian stood in the center of the room and looked at her back, at the line of her shoulders, at the simple dress that had clearly been chosen for comfort rather than appearance. I'm at the woman who had been locked in a stone tower the night before a royal ball and had responded by sitting down with a book on celestial navigation. "How long?" he asked. She turned slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "How long has she—" He searched for the right word and settled on the one that was accurate. "How long has she been doing this?" Elara turned fully to face him. In the candlelight, her expression was unreadable for a moment, and then she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who has been asked a question they were not expecting to be asked, by someone they were not expecting to ask it. 3 years, she said, since I came to this house. And your uncle? My uncle is very good at not looking at things he does not wish to see. She said it without bitterness, and that absence of bitterness struck him more forcibly than anger would have. She had moved past anger. She had metabolized it into something quieter and more durable, a clear-eyed understanding of the people around her that had no room left in it for the luxury of resentment. He's not an unkind man. He is simply a very small one. And you have remained here. Where else would I go? It was not a self-pitying question. She asked it the way she asked everything, directly, as a genuine inquiry, as if she genuinely wished to know what he would say. He found he did not have an immediate answer that was not hollow. You have the position at the palace, he said. A tutor's income does not support independent lodging in the city. She tilted her head slightly. Not without connections, or a family who would guarantee a lease, or a letter of reference from someone who— She stopped, the smallest pause. From someone who thought it was in their interest to provide one. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The fire in the small grate. She had managed to get it going, he realized, with whatever was in the room, resourceful as she was about everything, crackled in the silence between them. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees below, and the October dark pressed close against the window, and the candle burned its patient, steady burn. I came to the Hargreave dinner 6 weeks ago, Adrian said, because my secretary had arranged it, and there was nothing in my schedule that gave me sufficient reason to refuse. He moved to the small chair beside the writing table and sat, because his arms ached from the climb, and because sitting made him less imposing. Less the Duke of Kervon, who had arrived unannounced through a window, and more simply, a man in a cold room having a conversation that mattered. I have attended a very great number of such dinners in the past 2 years. I do not think I have been present at any of them in any real sense. Ilara watched him from the window. "You corrected Lord Ashby," he said. Something moved in her expression. The date of the battle. The date, the commanding general's name, and the correct disposition of the cavalry on the eastern flank, all in approximately 4 sentences. He held her gaze, without apology. He was wrong. He was. Adrian leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. He was also a baronet with 40 years of social precedent behind him, and you corrected him in front of 12 people, 2 of whom outranked him, and not 1 of whom had been willing to do it. Because being right required the risk of being rude. Ilara came away from the window and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the only other place to sit in the room. She settled there with the neat practicality of someone who had ceased to be bothered by difficult accommodations. And being rude without rank to excuse it is a very precarious position. And yet you did it. He was wrong about Kervon Pass. She said it simply. My father spent 3 months in that campaign. He wrote home about it. I have his letters. A beat. The correct date mattered. Adrian was quiet for a moment. He thought about his brother, who had loved history with the undisciplined passion of someone who loved things properly, who had read those same chronicles with dog-eared enthusiasm and argued with Adrian about the cavalry dispositions for an entire afternoon at Christmas time. 3 years before the horse, before the fall, before the autumn morning that closed everything. The Duke of Kervon was also at that battle, Adrian said carefully. He watched her understand. He watched her make the connection, the dukedom, the battle, the name, and he watched the expression on her face shift from careful neutrality to something more alert, more present. She was very quick. He had known she would be. Your father, she said. He survived it. He talked about it rarely. He believed that battles were something to be endured rather than commemorated. Adrian looked at his hands. The cut had stopped bleeding. He talked about it once to Philip, my brother, about how the men at Kervon Pass had held the line not because they were commanded to, but because they decided to. Because something in them decided this ground was worth defending. This moment was worth standing in. He said that was the only real courage he'd ever seen. Not the ordered kind, the chosen kind. The fire crackled. What happened to your brother? Ilara asked, and the directness of it, no careful hedging, no apologetic softening, landed with the exact quality he had come to expect from her. Not intrusive, just honest. Just willing to ask the real question because she had perceived that it was the real question. He died. Saw it 26 months ago. Adrian said it to the fire. A horse on a clear morning. There was nothing. There was no reason for it. It was not dangerous ground or difficult circumstances. It was simply an ordinary morning that became the last one. He paused. I sent him there alone because Parliament required me. The silence held. You blame yourself, she said. I was aware, this evening, that I am perhaps excessively accomplished at that particular exercise. He had meant it to have a certain rueful lightness, and it did. but she did not laugh. She looked at him with those clear, dark eyes, and she said, quite gently, "That is what guilt does when it has nowhere to go. It turns into a room you live in." He looked at her. "I know what it looks like," she said, "from the inside." He did not ask her what she felt guilty for, and he did not need to. He thought about what her father's death had cost her: the house, the income, the future, the dignity. And he thought about the very specific way that grief compounded by circumstance had a particular texture. The way it did not just hurt, but also took, stripping away the scaffolding that might have held you up while it did. "Your father," he said. "I should have managed it better." She said it without drama. The finances, the estate. I was 21, and I didn't understand how bad it had become, and by the time I did, the creditors were already there. She looked at her hands, the ink-stained fingers, the capable, unpretentious hands of a woman who had learned to do her own work. He was not careful. He was only loving, and I loved him for it. And I also did not see clearly enough, and both things are true. You were 21, old enough to have paid more attention. You are arguing for your own culpability with the same force you would use on someone else's self-deception, Adrian observed. I wonder if you would accept the same argument from another person. She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said at last. "I probably would not." "No," he agreed. It was the first time he realized that either of them had smiled at the same moment. It was a small thing. It was not insignificant. The fire was burning lower. Ilara rose and fed it from the small basket of wood someone had left in the room, a single concession to basic human necessity that had probably been placed there by the footman who felt guilty, Adrian thought, and by the boy who had looked at her with miserable resolve and followed his employer's orders because he had no choice, and she had allowed it because she understood that he didn't. She understood a great many things about people who had no choice. She had built her entire careful life around that understanding. "You cannot get me out tonight," she said, kneeling by the fire with her back to him. It was not a question. It was an assessment, delivered with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone thinking through logistics rather than appealing for rescue. "The lock is on the outside. I have no key. Even if you were to go down through the house, which I would not recommend. Lady Constance sleeps very lightly, and her rooms are below this corridor. It would create a scene that would end your evening considerably more publicly than either of us would prefer." "I am aware," Adrian said. "So." She sat back on her heels, looking at the fire. "You climbed 4 stories of ivy and stone, and you cannot actually accomplish anything by being here. That is one interpretation of the situation." She turned to look at him over her shoulder. "What is your interpretation?" He considered. He considered what he had intended when he left Lord Fenwick's gathering, what he had been moving toward in the 2 miles of dark Dorset lanes, what had driven his hands to the ivy and his boots to the stone, without any particular plan beyond the certainty that she should not be alone tonight. He thought about the word rescue and found it insufficient, not because rescue wasn't what he'd intended, but because it wasn't the whole of it, had never been the whole of it, had been, from the dinner table at Hargreaves 6 weeks ago, something considerably more than the impulse to correct an injustice. "My interpretation," he said, "is that you have been sitting alone in a locked tower on the night before an event that was given to you. Genuinely given. by someone who saw you clearly and wanted you present, and had it taken away by someone who did not. And I thought, he stopped. He started again. I thought you should not be alone with that. The fire popped. She was watching him with that unreadable expression again. The one that was actually, he had begun to understand. Very readable if you knew what you were looking for. The particular stillness of a person who is feeling something significant and has not yet determined whether it is safe to let it show. That is a very great deal of effort, she said finally, for the purpose of company. You are very good company. She turned fully away from the fire to face him. You have spoken to me once, at a dinner table, at a distance of 12 feet, for approximately 45 minutes, most of which were occupied with someone else being wrong about a battle. I have also thought about you for 6 weeks. The words landed in the room and stayed there. She did not deflect them. She did not perform surprise or pleasure or any of the responses that would have allowed him to feel he had said the right thing without actually responding to it. So she simply held his gaze with those clear brown eyes and let the statement exist between them in the cold air of the stone room without decoration. Why? She asked. The same words she had asked when he came through the window. The same honest, direct inquiry. Not fishing for a compliment, genuinely wanting to know. Because, Adrian said slowly, searching for the accurate thing, the true thing, the thing that was neither performance nor deflection. You did not apologize for being right. In a room full of people performing for each other, you simply said what was true. And then you went back to your dinner. She tilted her head. That is a very small thing to think about for 6 weeks. It wasn't a small thing to witness. He leaned forward. I have been at court since I was 18 years old. For I have sat across from kings and generals and ministers of state, and I have watched people perform their confidence, their certainty, their willingness to be right. I have watched men take up all the air in every room I have ever been in, not because they knew more, but because the world had taught them they were entitled to the space. He paused. And then I watched a woman in a faded dress tell the correct story about a battle that mattered to her father, with no authority behind her except the fact that she was right. And I thought, he stopped again. What did you think? Her voice was quiet now. I thought, there she is. There is someone real. The fire burned. The candle burned. The cold pressed against the window, and the dark held everything outside. And inside the small stone room, the silence had a quality neither of them seemed in any hurry to break, because what lived in the silence was not emptiness, but the careful, tentative beginning of understanding. I have been invisible for 3 years, Alaris said finally. I know. Not by choice? I know that too. She pressed her lips together. He could see the effort it cost her, the careful management of the thing that wanted to surface, the long-practiced discipline of a woman who had learned not to need things in front of people, because needing was a vulnerability that was consistently used against you in this house. The Crown Princess wrote to me herself, she said. Her voice was very steady. On the good paper, with the gold seal. A beat. I read the letter 6 times. I know, he said gently, because it has been 3 years since anyone said. She stopped. She looked at the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, stripped of its careful evenness. And what came through was not weakness, but truth, which in his experience was always more difficult than either. 3 years since anyone said, I want you here, Not your usefulness, not your silence, not your willingness to manage things without requiring anything in return. Just you, because you are worth wanting in the room. He was very still. And then it was taken. She set it to the fire as if she were simply stating a fact, and had decided to state it fully now that she had started. Because that is what happens. Every time there is something, every time there is a door that opens, there is always a Lady Constance, and the door closes. And I tell myself it is fine. I am fine. I have my books and my work, and the children love me, and that is enough, that is. She stopped. He crossed the room. He sat on the floor beside her, beside the fire, on the cold stone, in the manner of someone who had decided that this was not a moment for the appropriate distance between a duke and a woman to whom he had not yet been properly introduced by any social convention the world would recognize. He sat close enough that she was aware of him there, present, not going anywhere, in the manner of someone who had also decided they were done with distance. "It is not enough," he said quietly. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright in the firelight, not with tears exactly, but with the proximity of them, the thing held very carefully back. "No," she admitted. "It is not." He did not touch her. He did not reach for her hand or any other gesture that would have been, in this moment, too much, too fast, too weighted with everything that hadn't been said yet and needed to be said properly. He simply stayed beside her, in the warmth of the fire they were sharing in a locked tower above a house that had tried to make her feel like nothing, and he let his presence be the thing it was, chosen, deliberate, the decision of a man who had ridden through the dark and climbed 4 stories of stone wall specifically to sit here. After a long time, she said, "You should go, before the house wakes." "Yes," he agreed, not moving. She almost smiled. "You're not going." "I will." He looked at the window, at the dark beyond it, at the climb he would have to make in reverse. "I need you to trust me with something first." She waited. "Tomorrow," he said, "I am going to come to the front door of this house, as myself, as Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Caervon, with whatever face that puts on the proceedings. And I am going to ask to speak with your uncle." Alara was quiet for a moment. Lady Constance will have a very great deal to say, and none of it will matter," Adrian said, "because your uncle will receive me, as all men receive me when I appear in their doorways without warning. And I am going to tell him something that I think he has been carefully not thinking about for 3 years, which is that his niece is the personal guest of Crown Princess Sophia, and that the Crown Princess specifically requested her attendance, and that the failure to produce her at the Royal Winter Ball tomorrow evening is going to require a formal letter of explanation to the palace. Alara absorbed this. That is a great deal of pressure to apply to a man who does not particularly like pressure. Yes. And you believe it will work? He looked at her steadily. "I believe there is not a man in England who receives the Duke of Caervon on his doorstep and finds himself inclined to make the Duke wait, and I intend to use that with considerably less compunction than I usually permit myself." He paused. "I am done with permitting myself things." She looked at him for a long moment. In the firelight, her expression was serious and searching, and something else. Something that was not quite hope, but was the shape that hope makes before it allows itself to be hope. "So you said," she began, and then stopped. "What?" You said, just now. She searched for it. I am done with permitting myself things. What does that mean precisely? What is it you are permitting yourself? He held her gaze. He thought about 2 years of closed rooms and empty dinners, and the daily discipline of not feeling things, because feeling things was where the worst of it lived. He thought about Philip, who would have had several opinions about this moment, and expressed all of them at once. He thought about a woman who had looked at him across a dinner table and been simply, honestly, unavoidably real. You, he said. The word fell into the room with the quiet of something that had been waiting to be said for exactly as long as it had been true. I'm permitting myself you, whatever that means, whatever it becomes, starting tomorrow at your front door as myself. She held his gaze for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, I should warn you. I say what I think even when I shouldn't. I have ink on my fingers more often than not. I argue about things that most people consider settled. I will disagree with you, and I will tell you when I think you are wrong, and I will not do it gently. Good, said Adrian, and I am nobody by the measures this world uses. Then this world needs better measures. Something shifted in her face. The held thing found a hairline fracture and moved through it. Not a collapse. Nothing as dramatic as that, but a softening, a yielding. A small, private, real smile that had nothing to do with performance or convention or the careful management of other people's expectations. And was therefore, in his considered and extensive opinion, the most beautiful thing he had seen in 2 years. Go, she said softly, before the house wakes up. He rose. He crossed to the window. He looked back at her once, sitting by the fire she had built herself in a locked tower above a house that had tried to make her feel like nothing, with her dark hair loose and the candle burning on the table beside the navigation treatise she had raised at his window like a weapon. And he thought, there she is. There is someone real. The blue silk, he said, at the window. Whatever you would wear to a royal ball, have it ready. She blinked. How did you know about? I didn't, he smiled. But I do now. And then he went back through the window into the October dark and began the long climb down. He knocked at 9 o'clock precisely. Not the servants' entrance. The front door, wide and formal and flanked by stone columns, the door through which Alara had never once been invited to enter or depart as anything other than an afterthought. Adrian knocked on it with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his adult life been left waiting on a doorstep and had no intention of beginning today. The footman who opened it went pale. James, the same boy who had walked Alara up the tower stairs with misery in his eyes, looked at the Duke of Caervan standing in the morning light, with his crest visible on the carriage behind him, and stepped aside so quickly he nearly lost his footing. Lady Constance appeared at the top of the entrance hall stairs with the expression of a woman who had woken already certain of her victory and was now recalculating with considerable speed. Why, Your Grace, she said, descending with perfect composure. What an unexpected— I will need to speak with Lord Crane, Adrian said. Not unkindly, simply with the quality of certainty that did not leave room for negotiation. Now, if you please. What followed was not, precisely, a battle. Battles required 2 sides willing to fight. What it was, instead, was a very quiet conversation in Aldrich Crane's study, with the door closed and Lady Constance excluded from it for the first time, perhaps, in the history of their marriage. Adrian spoke for 4 minutes. He spoke about the Crown Princess's personal invitation, about the formal obligation to the palace, about the particular delicacy of explaining to a royal household why their specific guest had failed to appear. He spoke without raising his voice, without threatening, and without any instrument except the plain and factual weight of what was true. Aldrich Crane looked, for the first time in 6 months, directly at something. "The tower room," he said, very quietly. "Yes." A long silence. "James," said Lord Crane to the door. The key was produced within 3 minutes. Adrian did not go up himself. He waited in the entrance hall with his hat in his hands, and he listened to the footsteps ascending the stone stairs, and he looked at the front door through which he intended to walk with her before this morning was finished. She came down in the blue silk. It was not the most fashionable gown in the city. The cut was 2 seasons behind, and she had done her own hair because there was no maid assigned to her, and she had not asked for one, and she carried herself with the contained, or precise dignity of a woman who had decided that the condition of the gown mattered considerably less than the condition of the person wearing it. She looked, Adrian thought, extraordinary. Lady Constance stood at the foot of the stairs and said nothing. She had, perhaps for the first time, found the edges of the world she actually occupied, and understood that they were smaller than she had believed. Cecilia, behind her mother, looked at Alara with an expression that moved slowly from confusion to something that resembled, distantly, the first stirring of recognition. Alara did not look at either of them as she descended. She looked at Adrian. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked out the front door together into the October morning, and James held it open. And his expression was the uncomplicated relief of someone who had done a wrong thing and been granted an unexpected reprieve, and Alara touched his arm briefly as she passed, just briefly, just a light pressure of fingers, and said, "Thank you, James." And the boy's face went through something complicated and honest, and Adrian thought, there it is. There is exactly who she is. The Royal Winter Ball was everything the candlelight and the stone tower had not been. Grand, blazing, orchestrated to within an inch of its considerable life, filled with the concentrated splendor of a court that took its spectacle seriously and delivered it without apology. Crown Princess Sophia saw Alara the moment she entered. She crossed the room herself, not through an intermediary, not with a gesture summoning her forward, but herself, in her full royal magnificence, moving through the parted crowd with the purposeful warmth of a woman who had genuinely been waiting. "You are here," Sophia said, and took both of Alara's hands in hers, and looked at her with the uncomplicated gladness of someone whose concern had been resolved in the best possible way. "I was so worried." "I am here," Alara said. Her voice held. Sophia's eyes moved briefly to Adrian beside her, and something passed across the Crown Princess's expression. A swift, private satisfaction. The look of a woman who had suspected something and found herself proven correct, before she returned her full attention to her guest and said, "Come. I want to introduce you to someone who has read everything your father ever wrote about the Caervan campaign, and you will have a great deal to argue about." And she led Alara Voss in her 2 seasons old blue silk into the center of the most brilliant room in England. Adrian watched her go. He watched her enter the room, not tentatively, not with the careful self-erasure of a woman who had spent 3 years learning to take up less space, but with her head up and her shoulders straight, and that quality of precise, present attention that made every room she entered slightly more real. He watched people turn toward her, the way people turn toward things that are genuinely worth looking at. He watched the crown princess introduce her, and the man she was introduced to light up with the specific delight of someone who has just discovered a conversation they didn't know they were starving for. He watched the world make room for her, just because she was worth the room, because she had always been worth the room, because nothing about her had changed, except that tonight there was no one standing in the doorway deciding she could not enter. Later, much later, when the orchestra had moved from dancing into something slower, and the candles had burned low, and the grand room had acquired the warm, amber quality of an evening that has been fully inhabited, she found him by the long windows that overlooked the palace gardens. "You are watching again," she said, standing beside him. "I find I have developed a particular interest in watching you." She looked out at the gardens, at the frost on the hedges, catching the light from the windows, at the winter night spread out below them in silver and dark. Her reflection in the glass was clear and steady. "I owe you an apology," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For telling you last night that I say what I think even when I shouldn't, and argue about settled things, and will not be gentle when I disagree." She paused. "I presented it as a warning. It was actually a test." "And?" She turned from the window to face him, and in her expression was the thing that had been building since a tower room, and a fire, and a man on a stone floor, choosing proximity over distance. The thing she had been too careful, too practiced in not needing, to allow to surface until this moment, when the room behind her held the evidence that she existed, that she mattered, that the world had space for her, after all. "You did not flinch," she said. Adrian reached for her hand. She let him take it. His fingers closed around hers in the same quiet, so deliberate way he had offered his arm at the door of the house that had locked her away. The same certainty, the same chosen act of a man who had spent 2 years in the empty rooms of his own making and had decided, on a dark Dorset road, that he was finished with them. "I spent 6 weeks," he said, "thinking about a woman who corrected a baronet without apology, and 2 years before that learning what it costs to live as though you are not really there." He held her gaze. "I have no interest in flinching." She looked at him, clear-eyed, unhurried, with the full attention of a woman who saw things accurately and had decided, on the evidence available, that what she saw was worth the risk of seeing. "Then stay," she said, quietly. The same word she had used the night before in the tower, the same word in a completely different room, and with a completely different weight behind it now. "As long as you'll have me," he said. And when he kissed her, there by the long windows of the palace, with the frost on the gardens below, and the orchestra turning slowly in the amber light behind them, it felt like the most honest thing in the world, like a door that had been closed for a very long time, opening from both sides at once. Outside, the winter held everything in its clean, cold stillness. Inside, the Duke of Carvan held the hand of a woman the world had tried to make invisible, and she held his, and neither of them let go. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.